Chicago was a symphony of sirens and the ceaseless, percussive beat of a city that never slept. I'd spent 5 years as an ER nurse there, listening to its rhythm, patching up its victims. The final cadence had been the frantic, high-pitched beep of a monitor flatlining, the smell of copper and antiseptic, and the hollow look in a young cop's eyes. That was the ghost I was running from. Havenwood, Maine, was the antidote. My new house, a modest A-frame with a deck overlooking Loon Lake, was purchased for a song from a family that had moved south. It was early October, and the trees ringing the water were a blaze of dying fire, crimson and gold against the deep, stoic green of the pines. Unpacking the last of my boxes, the silence was so profound it felt like a physical pressure in my ears. This, I told myself, was healing. This was the peace I'd paid for with my sanity. I found him a week later. I was coming back from a supply run into town, the truck's headlights cutting through a curtain of cold, misty rain. He was just a heap on the shoulder of the winding lake road, a sodden mass of black and gray fur. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. My first thought was that I'd hit him. But as I knelt beside him, my flashlight beam tracing the line of his body, I saw the wound. It was a deep, ragged tear along his ribs, at least 8 inches long. The edges were shredded, peeled back like bark from a tree. This wasn't from a car. This was from something with claws. He was emaciated, but surprisingly heavy as I shifted him, a dense, compacted weight of bone and muscle that belied his starved frame. He was a skeleton draped in the hide of a German shepherd mixed with something wilder, something wolf-like. His eyes, when they opened, were a startling, intelligent amber. They held no plea, only a deep, weary pain. My ER instincts took over. My EMT-style duty bag was always in the truck, stocked with saline, lidocaine, and suture kits. I cleaned the wound as best I could in the drizzling dark, first confirming with relief that the wound hadn't breached the pleura. His lungs were safe. The dog let out only a low whine. Back at the house, I stitched the gash with suture thread I'd borrowed from the hospital, my hands steady for the first time in months. I called him Lobo. The name just fit. The first 3 weeks were a quiet routine of healing for both of us. I fed him, changed his dressings, and spoke to him in a low, calm voice. He never barked. At first, he watched me with a wary distance, but slowly, he began to trust. He'd limp over and rest his head on my knee. Soon he was sleeping on the rug at the foot of my bed, a silent, watchful shadow. We'd take short, careful walks along the pebbled shoreline. The wound on his side healed with an unnatural speed, knitting together until by the 3rd week, it was just a clean, silver thread of a scar, barely visible beneath his thickening fur. He was my anchor in this sea of quiet, the one living thing that shared my solitude. That's when the sounds started. They came only at night, drifting across the water from the center of the lake. It wasn't the autumnal croaking of the last hardy frogs or the high yipping cry of a fox. It was a wet, clicking sound, intermittent and guttural. Sometimes it sounded like pebbles being rolled around in a phlegmy throat. Other times it was a soft, almost conversational thump-thump slap, like a heavy waterlogged carpet being beaten against a rock. I dismissed it as the strange acoustics of the valley, the sounds of deer or moose at the water's edge. Lobo knew better. As dusk bled across the sky, his demeanor would shift. The playful companion of the day would vanish, replaced by a sentinel. He would sit for hours before the large picture window in the living room, the one that offered an unbroken view of the lake. His body would be rigid, his ears pricked forward. Sometimes the hackles on his neck would rise, and a growl would rumble in his chest, a vibration in the floorboards more than a sound. He stared at the black, glassy surface of Loon Lake as if he could see into its depths, as if he knew what was making those sounds. On a trip to the Havenwood General Store for supplies, I mentioned it to the man behind the counter, a wiry old-timer named Fitzwilliam, with a face like a road map of Maine. "Strange noises from the lake at night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He stopped bagging my groceries, his hand still for a moment. He forced a craggy smile. "That's just the woods settling, son. Things sound different out here. But I'll tell you what my pappy told me. Don't go wandering by the water after dark. Quicksand and bogs. The lake'll swallow you whole if you're not careful." He winked, but his eyes held no humor. They held a flicker of something else, something old and worn out, like fear. That night I stood beside Lobo at the window, my hand resting on his tense shoulders. The clicking from the lake seemed closer, more distinct. The water was a sheet of obsidian, reflecting the sliver of a cold moon. For the first time, it didn't look peaceful. It looked like a lid, holding something down. The quiet I had so desperately sought now felt like a held breath before a scream. The piece I'd bought felt like a cheap forgery, and I was starting to see the brushstrokes. The scream came a week later, and it wasn't human. It was Lobo, his barks frantic and sharp, a stark contrast to his usual silent vigilance. He was at the back door, the one leading out to the small, gravel-strewn yard that sloped down toward the woods. He wasn't just barking. He was throwing his 100-plus pounds against the wood, his claws scrabbling for purchase. It was 3 a.m. and the house was pitch black. My heart hammered against my ribs as I crept to the kitchen window. I peered through the blinds, my breath fogging the cold glass, and I saw it. At the edge of the property line, where my unkempt lawn met the solid wall of pine trees, a figure stood. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and impossibly thin, like a charcoal sketch of a man drawn with a trembling hand. Its limbs seemed to hang at impossible angles, its head cocked to one side. I couldn't make out a face, only a silhouette against the lesser dark of the forest. But its very posture screamed that it was wrong. Alien. It stood perfectly still for a long, stretched-out moment, and then it didn't run or walk away. It seemed to retract, melting back into the shadows of the trees as if they were made of the same substance. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. I should have had a gun. Part of me knew that the moment I moved here. But after 5 years of patching up gunshot wounds in Chicago, I'd sworn off them, a vow that felt foolish and naive now. The voice of the dispatcher was thick with sleep. I knew what that meant out here. One man, probably the sheriff himself, driving a long way to check on a spooked city boy. I babbled something about a prowler, a trespasser. 20 minutes later, the slow, crunching sound of tires on my gravel driveway announced the arrival of the local law. Sheriff Brody was a man who looked like he'd been poured into his uniform and had been wearing it since the Carter administration. He was thick-set, with a weary face and eyes that had seen too many small-town dramas. "You're the fella from Chicago," he said, his voice a low rumble. He swept the beam of a heavy maglite across the yard. Didn't see anyone on the road in. We walked the perimeter, Lobo now silent but pressed against my leg, a low growl still vibrating in his chest. There were my footprints in the damp earth and Lobo's paw prints. Nothing else. Brody kicked at a pile of wet leaves. "Lot of shadows out here, Mr. Turner. Lot of noises, coyotes, bears, moose, not like the city. Your mind can play tricks on you. His tone wasn't unkind, but the message was clear. I was a jumpy city boy, wasting his time. He told me to keep my doors locked and call if I saw anything definitive. Then he was gone, leaving me alone with the oppressive silence and the certainty of what I'd seen. My newfound peace was shattered. Paranoia became my new companion. The next day, I drove 2 hours to Augusta and spent a small fortune. I bought a security system with motion-sensitive floodlights and 4 cameras, and at a pawn shop, a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun and a box of shells. I spent my nights huddled in my desk chair, watching the 4-way split on my monitor, a mug of coffee growing cold in my hands. The system worked perfectly. The floodlights would blaze to life, revealing a raccoon digging in the trash, a doe and her fawn stepping delicately across the lawn, or just a branch swaying in the wind. The cameras showed me nothing but nature. There were no unnaturally tall figures, no monsters in the dark. I started to wonder if Brody was right. Was the stress, the trauma from Chicago finally fracturing my sanity? Lobo's behavior was the only thing that kept me believing. He had become a true warden of the property. He didn't sleep through the night anymore. I'd watch him on the monitor, a ghostly gray shape making his rounds. He'd methodically patrol the perimeter of the house, from the deck facing the lake to the back door facing the woods, his nose to the ground, his ears swiveling to catch every snap of a twig. It was unsettling, but also a strange comfort. He was on guard even if I didn't know for what. I took him to the town vet for a checkup, mostly as an excuse to get a professional opinion. Dr. Mills was a kind, middle-aged woman with gentle hands. "He's a magnificent animal, Alex," she said, running her hands over Lobo's powerful shoulders. I can't quite place his breed. Shepherd, a lot of it, but there's something else. His bone structure is dense, and this musculature is incredible. She examined the scar on his ribs, her brow furrowed. For a wound that severe, this healing is textbook perfect. Almost too perfect. Not even a hint of infection. You did a good job, but he's a fast healer. The sounds from the lake were changing, too. They grew more frequent, louder. The clicking was still there, but now it was joined by a definite wet slapping. It was the sound of something heavy and soaked being dragged across mud and rock. The cameras I'd aimed at the shoreline showed nothing but ripples on the water, but we both heard it every night. Lobo would stand at the window, his body a coiled spring, and I would stand behind him, my hand on the shotgun I now kept by the door. One morning, a week after the sheriff's visit, I was raking the thick carpet of damp, decaying leaves near the water's edge. And then I saw them. Pressed into a patch of soft mud near a cluster of reeds were 3 distinct prints. They weren't animal, and they weren't human. Each was over a foot long, with 3 long, splayed toes that ended not in claws, but in blunt, spade-like tips. Between the toes were the clear, undeniable impressions of webbing. The mud around the prints was coated in a thin, gelatinous slime that shimmered in the weak morning sun, smelling faintly of algae and rot. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone and took a dozen pictures from every angle. I watched as the sun slowly baked the slime into a brittle, transparent film, and the prints began to lose their definition. I finally had proof. But proof of what? I had no idea. And a terrifying question began to form in my mind. Proof for who? The photos on my phone were my grip on reality. They were grainy, sure, and the light wasn't great. But they were there. Indisputable. 3-toed, webbed footprints. My medical mind raced, trying to file this away into a logical box. A misidentified animal? A heron, maybe? No, the prints were massive, the stride too long. Some kind of undiscovered amphibian. A local mutation caused by, what? Farm runoff? It was a flimsy shield of rationality against a rising tide of primal fear. I needed more than my own frantic speculation. I needed history. I drove into town, the phone feeling heavy in my pocket, and walked into the Havenwood Public Library. It was a small, charming stone building that smelled of old paper and lemon polish. Behind a circulation desk sat a woman who looked as though she'd been planted there a century ago. A small brass plaque read, Eleanor Gable, Town Historian. Mrs. Gable was a tiny woman with sharp, intelligent eyes behind thick spectacles. When I started asking my questions, her polite librarian smile tightened. I was careful, framing my inquiry around local folklore and animal life, not a 7-foot-tall shadow man and slimy frog prints. I asked about strange sightings around the lake, old legends, anything unusual. Every small town has its boogeyman, Mr. Turner, she said, her voice crisp. She saw the desperation in my eyes, though, the frantic edge I couldn't quite hide. She sighed, a puff of air that seemed to stir the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. All right, the archives are in the basement. Let's see what we can find. The basement was a cramped, musty space, a catacomb of filing cabinets and shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound ledgers and yellowed newspapers. Mrs. Gable, with the practiced air of a seasoned archaeologist, pulled out a dusty box file labeled Local Folklore and Unverifieds. The people who lived here long before us, the Mi'kmaq, they had stories about Loon Lake, she began, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. They spoke of the Pukalmujweskch. Loosely, it means the water-crusted people. The legends said they were ancient beings that lived in the deepest, coldest parts of the lake. They weren't evil, not exactly. More territorial. The stories say that once a generation, when the signs were right, they would come ashore to reclaim. They never said what. She paused, looking at me over her glasses. The legends describe them as tall, frog-like men who could mimic the cry of a lost child or a woman in distress to lure people to the water's edge. My blood ran cold. A shiver traced its way up my spine that had nothing to do with the basement's chill. It's just a story, of course, she added quickly, but she didn't sound convinced. She then pulled out a folder of brittle newspaper clippings. Disappearances, Loon Lake region. They were dated sporadically. 1934, 1962, 1991. Each time, a small rash of people had vanished. A lone fisherman, a pair of teenage hikers. The official reports always concluded the same thing. Accidental drownings, poor weather, getting lost in the dense woods. But the dates, they were roughly 30 years apart. A generation. The last cluster of disappearances was in the early 90s. It had been almost 30 years since then. As I sifted through the files, my fingers numb, I found something else. It was in a slim, self-published volume of regional myths, tucked away in the back of the box. Most of it was the standard stuff about spectral lumberjacks and ghosts of the Civil War. But one chapter mentioned the Pukalmujweskch, and it also mentioned their eternal enemy, an opposing force. The legends called it Malsum-i-Weskch, the wolf spirit, a guardian that would appear only once in a generation, embodying itself when the water-crusted people became active. It was said to take the form of an unusually large wolf or dog, and it would hunt the hunters, protecting the human settlements that encroached on its territory. The description of its ferocity, its size, its almost supernatural resilience. It was like reading a biography of Lobo. I thanked Mrs. Gable, my mind a whirlwind of impossible connections. I drove home in a daze, the setting sun painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The world felt thin, like a veil about to be torn. That night, sleep was a shallow, restless thing. I was jolted awake not by a sound, but by a sudden absolute silence. The normal night noises, the wind, the distant hum of the highway had ceased. And then came a new sound. Scrape. 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 It was the sound of a claw or a fingernail being dragged slowly and deliberately down the large pane of glass of the living room window. My heart stopped. Lobo was already on his feet, not barking, but emitting a low, guttural snarl that was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. I forced myself to look. Pressed against the glass, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was a face. It was monstrously amphibian, with slick, mottled green-gray skin. Its mouth was a wide, lipless slit. But the eyes were the worst part. They were huge, perfectly round, and as black as the lake's depths. They were pupil-less, depthless orbs that reflected the dim light of my living room, but betrayed nothing of what lay behind them. Below the face, a hand was pressed to the glass, a long, three-fingered, webbed hand, just like the prints. The creature's black eyes stared right at me. It saw me. With a roar of fury, Lobo launched himself across the room. He didn't hit the glass, but skidded to a stop before it, his barks now deafening, explosive. The creature at the window recoiled, its face vanishing from the light so quickly it was as if it had never been there. I stood there, hyperventilating, my entire body trembling. The legends were real. The 30-year cycle was real. And the wolf spirit was currently pacing in front of my window, his teeth bared, ready for a war I hadn't even known was being waged. I was no longer an observer of this town's weird history. I was standing on the front line. The next 3 days were spent in a state of high-strung, frantic preparation. The silence from the lake returned, but it was no longer a peaceful quiet. It was a loaded, predatory silence. The silence of a hunter waiting for its prey to make a mistake. I boarded up the windows on the ground floor, using every piece of spare lumber I could find in the shed. The rhythmic pounding of the hammer was a desperate drumbeat against the encroaching dread. I screwed 2x4s over the picture window, sacrificing the view for a flimsy sense of security. I checked the locks on the doors a dozen times a day. I slept on the couch in the living room, the shotgun clutched in my hands, its weight a pathetic comfort. Lobo never left my side. He was a constant, tense presence, a living barometer of the coming storm. He barely ate. He didn't nap. He just watched and waited, his body a coiled spring. His anxiety was a contagion, seeping into my bones, making the hair on my arms stand up at the slightest sound. This waiting was a unique form of torture, a slow tightening wire around my chest. The storm broke on the 4th night. It started with rain, a cold, persistent drizzle that quickly escalated into a downpour, drumming against the roof and streaking down the unboarded windows of the 2nd floor. And with the rain came the sounds, that familiar, wet slapping. But it wasn't coming from the lake anymore. It was coming from the yard, from all sides. It wasn't 1 or 2 sets of footsteps. It was dozens. My blood turned to ice. I scrambled up the stairs to my bedroom, my only vantage point now. Peering through the rain-slicked glass, I saw them. My heart seized in my chest. They were emerging from the dark water of the lake, one after another, like a slow, nightmarish birth. Tall, slender silhouettes, moving with a lurching, unnatural gait. They didn't seem to mind the torrential rain. They looked like they were born of it. I counted. 1, 2, 5, 10. At least a dozen of them. Maybe more. Their dark, glistening forms shambling purposefully, relentlessly toward my house. My hands, slick with sweat, fumbled for my phone. "They're here! They're surrounding my house! Please, you have to send someone!" "Sir, what is surrounding your house?" The dispatcher's voice was calm, professionally detached. He thought I was a drunk or a lunatic. Help wouldn't be in time. "I don't know! Monsters! The things from the lake! Just send someone!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "A patrol car is on its way, sir. Please stay on the line and lock your doors." I knew with a sickening certainty that he didn't believe me. Help wasn't coming. Not in time. The first impact shuddered through the house, a heavy, wet thud against the boarded-up kitchen window. Then another and another. They weren't just randomly flailing. They were testing, probing for weakness with a terrifying, methodical intelligence. A loud crack echoed from the living room. One of the 2x4s I'd nailed over the big window had splintered. Through the gap, a slimy, three-fingered hand slithered, its webbed digits blindly groping in the dark. Lobo, who had been a statue of snarling tension at my feet, exploded into action. With a guttural roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house, he launched himself at the breach. He clamped his powerful jaws around the intruding limb. A horrific, piercing shriek, like a pig being slaughtered, echoed from outside, and the hand was violently yanked back. But the reprieve was short-lived. From the back of the house came the sickening sound of shattering glass. The small, unboarded window in the laundry room. They were in. I backed into the corner of the living room, clutching the shotgun so hard my knuckles were white. Two of the creatures slithered through the broken doorway from the utility hall. In the dim light, they were even more horrifying than I had imagined. They stood nearly 7 feet tall, their skin a slick, mottled gray-green, like a diseased frog. Their limbs were long and spindly, but they moved with a wiry strength. Their lipless mouths hung open, emitting a constant low, clicking chatter. And their eyes, those huge, black, pupilless eyes fixed on me. Lobo met them head-on. He was a whirlwind of black fur and fury, a demon of righteous rage. He slammed into the first creature, knocking it off its feet, his teeth sinking into its throat. Dark, viscous fluid that smelled of stagnant pond water sprayed across the wall. But as he was occupied, the second creature lashed out with one of its long arms, a blow that sent Lobo tumbling across the floor with a pained yelp. Before he could recover, the creature was on him, its full weight pinning him to the ground, its spade-like claws digging into his flesh. Lobo let out a high, thin whine of agony. My friend, my only protector. He was dying. A wave of absolute paralyzing terror washed over me, rooting me to the spot. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch the nightmare unfold. A scream tore from my throat, a sound of pure, hopeless despair. I was going to die here in this house, torn apart by things that shouldn't exist. In that moment, watching the life fade from my dog's eyes, a part of me welcomed it. Just as the last ounce of hope drained from me, something impossible happened. The creature pinning Lobo shrieked and recoiled as if it had been burned. Beneath it, Lobo's body began to convulse. It wasn't the shuddering of an animal in its death throes. This was something else, something violent and unnatural. A sound filled the room, a series of wet, percussive pops and cracks. The sound of bones dislocating, lengthening, and snapping back into new, horrifying configurations. My medical mind screamed at the impossibility of it. The instantaneous generation of mass, the cellular reconstruction, a violation of every known biological and metabolic law. This wasn't a magical, shimmering transformation from a movie. This was a biological nightmare, an agonizing, grotesque metamorphosis. Tufts of Lobo's fur fell away as his skin stretched taut over a rapidly expanding frame. His muzzle elongated with a sickening tearing sound, his spine arching and reforming. His legs buckled, and then straightened, growing longer, more powerful. His paws twisting and spreading into something that was neither paw nor hand, tipped with thick black claws that sliced through the floorboards. Where my dog had been, there now stood a monster. It rose to its full height, nearly 8 feet tall, a bipedal titan of sinew and dark fur. A terrifying fusion of man and wolf, it was built with a predator's brutal economy. Its shoulders were broad, its arms corded with muscle, and its head was a lupine nightmare crowned with laid-back ears and filled with a maw of dagger-like teeth. And its eyes, they were no longer the warm amber of my dog. They were glowing, feral yellow slits, burning with an ancient, untamable rage. It threw its head back and a roar erupted from its chest, not a bark or a growl, but a sound of pure primal fury and agony that vibrated through my bones and rattled the very frame of the house. The creature that had been tormenting Lobo froze for a split second, its black eyes wide with what looked like dawning recognition and terror. That second was all the werewolf needed. It moved with a speed that defied its bulk, closing the distance in a single fluid bound. One clawed hand, the size of a dinner plate, swiped through the air. The impact was like a side of beef hitting a wall. The creature was thrown across the room, its neck bent at an impossible angle, and it crumpled into a heap, silent and still. The other creature in the room, the one Lobo had injured earlier, tried to scramble back toward the hallway. The werewolf was on it in 2 long strides. It didn't bother with claws. It seized the thing's head in its massive hands and with a single brutal twist snapped its spine. The wet crack echoed in the sudden silence. The room was a charnel house, slick with dark, foul-smelling ichor. More of them were trying to force their way through the front door, the wood groaning under their combined weight. The werewolf didn't hesitate. It moved to stand directly between them and me, planting its powerful legs, its body becoming a living wall of fur and muscle. It fought not like a mindless beast, but like a seasoned warrior. Its movements were precise, economical, and utterly lethal. Every swipe of its claws, every snap of its jaws was a killing blow. It was defending its territory. It was defending me. The creatures outside, faced with this sudden, unstoppable whirlwind of violence, hesitated. Their chittering chatter turned into high-pitched squeals of alarm. From the direction of the lake, a new sound arose, a deep, gurgling, commanding shriek. It must have been their leader, a signal. Instantly, the assault ceased. The remaining creatures began to retreat, pulling their dead and wounded with them, melting back into the rain and the darkness, leaving only their dead that were inside the house. The werewolf stood in the center of the ruined living room, its massive chest heaving. It slowly turned its head, and its burning yellow eyes met mine. For a terrifying eternal second, I saw the monster, the killer. But then, for just a fraction of a heartbeat, the feral blaze in its eyes softened. And in that moment, I didn't see a monster. I saw Lobo. My Lobo. A flicker of recognition, of shared history, of the bond we had forged. Then the strength seemed to abandon it. The massive form swayed, stumbled, and collapsed onto the floor with a heavy thud. the gruesome process of the transformation reversed itself, just as violent and agonizing as the first time. The bones cracked and reset. The muscles shrank, the monstrous form contracting in on itself. When it was over, my dog lay on the floorboards, bleeding from a dozen new wounds on top of the old ones, his flank rising and falling with shallow, pained breaths. He was alive. The house was silent, save for Lobo's whimpering and my own ragged gasps for air. And then a new sound cut through the night, a distant, human sound, growing steadily closer. The wail of police sirens. Sheriff Brody and a young, pale-faced deputy were the first through the door, shotguns held at the ready. They stopped dead in the entryway, their expressions shifting from tactical readiness to slack-jawed disbelief. The scene that greeted them was something straight out of a slaughterhouse. My living room was a Jackson Pollock painting of dark, viscous slime and gore. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the rank, swampy odor of the lake. And in the middle of it all were the bodies, or what was left of them. Two mangled, inhuman corpses, their three-fingered hands and webbed feet leaving no doubt as to their unnatural origin. I was on the floor, my back against the couch, my arms wrapped around my wounded dog. I was in shock. My mind a static-filled void, unable to process anything beyond the warm, sticky feel of Lobo's blood on my hands. Brody's eyes swept the scene, taking in the bodies, the destruction, me, and finally, the bleeding dog at my side. He didn't reach for his radio. Instead, he holstered his shotgun, pulled out a thick satellite phone from a pouch on his belt, and turned his back to me. He dialed a single number. "Brody," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "Loon Lake. We have a breach. Code Sigma." He listened for a moment, then grunted. "Affirmative. The resident is secure." He clicked the phone off and turned to me, his face an unreadable mask. "Don't touch anything, Mr. Turner. Don't call anyone. Just stay with your dog. Help is on the way." It wasn't the kind of help I was expecting. A few hours later, as the first gray light of dawn began to dilute the darkness, it wasn't flashing red and blue lights that arrived, but the silent, heavy presence of two black, unmarked panel vans. They rolled up my driveway with an unnerving lack of sound. Men in dark tactical gear, armed with suppressed rifles, fanned out to secure the perimeter. They were followed by a team in full hazmat suits, their faces obscured by reflective visors. They moved with a chilling, silent efficiency that spoke of long practice. A woman in a crisp black pantsuit emerged from one of the vans. She was in her 40s, with sharp features and cold, analytical gray eyes that missed nothing. She strode into my wrecked home as if walking into a board meeting, her expression one of detached professionalism. She surveyed the carnage, her gaze lingering on the corpses, then on Lobo, and finally on me. "Agent Thorne," she said, her voice as clipped and sterile as her appearance. "Bureau of Preternatural Stewardship. We'll take it from here, Sheriff." Brody just nodded, looking immensely relieved to be handing off this nightmare. Thorne's team, the cleaners as I came to think of them, worked with a speed that was both impressive and terrifying. The hazmat crew began bagging the bodies in thick black polymer sacks. They took samples of the blood, the slime, the air itself. They photographed every inch of the room. A second team, dressed in simple work clothes, arrived and began the process of erasure. They ripped out the blood-soaked floorboards and cut away sections of drywall. By midday, another unmarked truck arrived with pre-cut lumber and fresh materials. They worked through the day, aiming to remove every physical trace that this night had ever happened. One of the agents, a man with kind eyes that contrasted with his grim task, knelt beside me. "I'm the team's veterinarian," he said softly. "Let me see to your dog." I reluctantly let him. He was gentle, his hands surprisingly deft. He administered a sedative and an antibiotic, cleaned and stitched Lobo's wounds with a skill that surpassed my own. But as he worked, I saw him discreetly draw a vial of Lobo's blood and pluck a few strands of fur, sealing them in small, labeled evidence bags. He wasn't just a vet. He was a scientist, collecting data. When he was done, 2 of the tactical agents helped me to my feet. "Agent Thorne would like a word with you, Mr. Turner," one of them said, his voice polite but firm. They escorted me out of my home and into the back of one of the vans. The interior was cold, metallic, and sterile. They gave me a bottle of water that I later realized was laced with a mild sedative. Through the van's small, tinted window, I watched as a team of government specters systematically dismantled the reality of my life, scrubbing away the horror until nothing remained. My home was a crime scene, and the evidence being erased wasn't the crime itself, but the fact that it was impossible. Before the heavy door slid shut, I saw Sheriff Brody standing by his cruiser. "Brody!" I called out, my voice hoarse. "What the hell were those things?" He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a deep, profound weariness in his eyes, a sorrow that went beyond a single bad night. "Something you're better off not knowing, son," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's why they call this place Havenwood, because most of the time it is. But every so often the deep water gets hungry." The door slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. The van didn't take me to a police station. We drove for maybe 20 minutes down a series of unmarked logging roads before arriving at a temporary command post that had materialized in a clearing. It was a collection of tents and trailers, humming with the quiet power of generators, all under the sterile glare of portable light towers. I was escorted into a trailer that was set up as a Spartan interrogation room. A metal table, 2 chairs, and a one-way mirror. Agent Thorne was already there, a file open in front of her. This wasn't a cop's interview, it was a debriefing. She didn't ask if I'd seen anything. She knew I had. Her questions were clinical, precise. "How many did you count, Mr. Turner?" Described their vocalizations. "Did they display tactical coordination?" She referred to them as in cursives. It was clear this wasn't their first rodeo. I was just the latest civilian to stumble into their secret war. I answered her questions about the creatures as best I could, my sedated mind struggling to recall the details of the horror. But then she got to the heart of the matter. "My team counted 12 incursives on the property, 2 of them inside your residence. All of them were neutralized with extreme prejudice. The forensic report suggests a single, highly aggressive terrestrial actor," she said, her gray eyes locking onto mine, cold and sharp as surgical steel. "You are one man, Mr. Turner. You are not armed. Explain to me how you survived." This was the moment, the pivot point. My loyalty to the creature that had saved me versus the immense, terrifying power of the organization she represented. A primal, protective instinct washed over me, cutting through the fog of the sedative. I would not give them my dog. I would not give them Lobo. I looked her straight in the eye and lied. "I didn't," I said, my voice trembling, which wasn't hard to fake. "When they broke in, I ran. I locked myself in the upstairs bathroom. I heard screaming, fighting, tearing sounds. I just huddled in the bathtub and prayed. I didn't see anything. I swear to God, I just waited until the sirens came." Thorne's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Disappointment? Skepticism? She didn't believe me. Not for a second. Your story is convenient, Mr. Turner. We have protocols for these situations. To formally close this report, I'll need you to submit to a portable voice stress analysis. It wasn't a request. I knew refusing was the same as confessing. Okay, I whispered. They didn't hook me up to anything. A technician just placed a small device on the table. As he asked his baseline questions, I focused my mind. I didn't think about the lie. I thought about the truth of the emotion behind it. I summoned the absolute gut-wrenching terror I felt when I saw that webbed hand press against my window. I remembered the paralyzing fear as Lobo went down, the certainty of my own death. When he asked, "Did you see who or what killed the incursives?" I focused on the image of myself cowering in the corner, and I answered, "No." The light on the machine remained green. I had passed. My genuine terror had masked my lie. A technician entered and handed Thorne a tablet. She scanned the screen, her lips a thin, hard line. "Preliminary analysis of the K9 subject is anomalous," she said, not looking at me. "Genetic markers inconsistent with any known species in the Canidae family. Unprecedented cellular regeneration. Off-the-charts platelet and white blood cell counts." She looked up at me then, a new, calculating light in her eyes. She knew. She didn't have proof, but she knew the dog was the terrestrial actor. And now she was looking at me, the dog's owner, as an asset or a complication. "Mr. Turner," she said, closing the file, "here is what is going to happen. The Bureau will compensate you for the full market value of your property, plus a significant sum for your distress. We will execute a quitclaim deed this afternoon. In return, you will sign this." She slid a thick document across the table. It was a non-disclosure agreement, but it read like a life sentence. It bound me to absolute silence regarding the events of tonight, the existence of the incursives, and the Bureau of Preternatural Stewardship itself. The penalty for violation was life in a federal prison under charges of espionage and treason. I signed it. My signature was a shaky scrawl. As I handed the pen back, Thorne leaned forward. "This is for you," she said, sliding a cashier's check across the table, drawn on a shell corporation I'd never heard of. "And let me be clear," she said, her voice dropping to a low, menacing hush. "This is not over. We now have a file on you, and on your pet. If anomalous events begin occurring wherever you choose to relocate, we will not come with questions next time. We will come with orders. You are now a person of interest, Mr. Turner. Do not give us a reason to become more interested." They drove me back to my house. It was pristine. The boards were gone from the windows, the glass replaced. The floorboards were new, the walls freshly painted. It smelled of sawdust and chemicals, not blood and death. It was as if the siege had never happened. Lobo met me at the door, walking with a slight limp, but otherwise looking remarkably healed. He whined softly and pressed his head against my hand. The house was clean, but it was poisoned. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboards would forever be a reminder of the nightmare it had held. We couldn't stay. The silence in the sterilized house was heavier than it had ever been. It was the silence of a tomb. Lobo lay on the new rug, his head on his paws, watching me with those amber eyes that I now understood held impossible depths. My world had been fundamentally broken and reassembled into a new, terrifying shape, and this animal, this thing, was the centerpiece of it. I looked at him, and I didn't just see a dog anymore. I saw a savior. I saw a monster. I saw a secret I was now bound by law and loyalty to protect with my life. I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands, the exhaustion hitting me like a physical blow. The adrenaline, the sedatives, the sheer mental trauma of the last 12 hours had left me hollowed out. Lobo got up, his movements still a little stiff, and padded over to me. He didn't lick my hand or nudge me playfully. He just laid his heavy head on my knee and looked up at me. And in that moment, I understood. The look in his eyes wasn't just the simple devotion of a pet. It was deeper, more complex. It was a look of gratitude. He was thanking me for pulling him from that roadside ditch, for stitching him up, and for lying to the cold-eyed woman in the black suit, for protecting him just as he had protected me. In that shared, silent understanding, the bond between us was forged anew. No longer just man and dog, but two survivors, two partners in a secret war. A covenant was sealed in the quiet of that unnaturally clean room. I let out a long, shuddering breath. The need for a rational, scientific explanation was gone, burned away by the sight of his transformation. The world was not what I thought it was. Monsters were real. But my monster was on my side. The fear I should have felt toward him never came. It was replaced by an immense, crushing weight of responsibility. I had to protect him, not just from things like the incursives, but from people like Agent Thorne. The Bureau of Preternatural Stewardship didn't want to study him. They wanted to dissect him, to weaponize him. The decision was easy. We had to leave. Staying in Havenwood was impossible. The lake would forever be a source of terror, every shadow a potential threat, and Thorne's people would be watching. The Bureau's interest was a spotlight, and we needed to live in the dark. I didn't know if the Pukalmujweskch would be back, but I couldn't risk it. My first priority was getting Lobo somewhere safe, somewhere anonymous. I started packing that night. I moved with a feverish energy, throwing things into boxes with little regard for order. I packed clothes, my medical kit, some tools. I left behind the furniture, the dishes, the ghost of the man who had come here seeking peace. The Bureau-recommended realtor had already taken care of the paperwork for the quick sale. The money was in my hand. It was all unnervingly efficient. Hush money. My nights were no longer spent watching security monitors. They were spent on my laptop, diving down rabbit holes of the internet I never knew existed. I wasn't looking for folklore anymore. I was looking for patterns. I cross-referenced obscure scientific papers on deep water ecosystems and bioluminescence with encrypted forums discussing cryptozoology and fringe theories. I searched for whispers of other government agencies, other cleanup crews. And I searched for lycanthropy, not the Hollywood version, but any hint, any rumor of a biological basis, a genetic line, a species. A new terrifying thought began to take shape in my mind. What if Lobo wasn't a curse? What if he wasn't an anomaly? What if he was a function, a biological countermeasure, evolved over millennia to deal with threats like the incursives? A guardian, a wolf spirit, just as the Mi'kmaq legend had said. If that were true, then taking him from Havenwood felt like a dereliction of duty. I might be saving him, but I might also be condemning that town to a future horror with no one to stand in the way. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, my duty was to the creatures sleeping at my feet. The world had become a much bigger, scarier place, but my own world had shrunk to the confines of my pickup truck and the well-being of my monstrous, loyal friend. I packed the last box, my gaze falling on the shotgun I'd kept by the couch. It didn't seem pathetic now. It seemed essential. I took one last drive through Havenwood. The town looked different, like a movie set after the cameras stopped rolling. The charming storefronts, the quaint town square. It all seemed like a fragile facade, a paper-thin mask over a gaping, watery maw. The people I saw, waving from their porches or walking their dogs, looked impossibly naive, blissfully unaware of the abyssal horrors that slept just a few hundred yards away. I felt like a man who had seen behind the curtain, and the knowledge was a bitter, isolating poison. I saw Sheriff Brody's cruiser parked outside the general store. He was leaning against it, sipping coffee from a thermos. As I pulled up, he just nodded, his face etched with a weary resignation. He didn't ask where I was going. He already knew. "Good luck to you, Turner," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He glanced at Lobo, who was sitting silently in my passenger seat. "And take care of that dog. A good dog is a rare thing these days." It was as close to an admission as I was ever going to get. He knew. He knew what Lobo was, and he was grateful. His handshake was firm, a final, silent acknowledgement of the secret we now shared. My last stop was the library. I had to return the books Mrs. Gable had lent me. She was behind the counter, and the sharp, intelligent look in her eyes was softened by a deep sadness. She knew I was leaving. She took the books without a word, but as I turned to go, she called my name. "Mr. Turner." She slid a folded piece of paper across the counter. It was a Xerox of an old hand-drawn map of the state, dotted with topographical markers for lakes and waterways. "Sometimes," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "evil doesn't like to stay in one place. It gets restless. It looks for new, quiet waters." It was her parting gift, a warning and a tool. As my truck cleared the Havenwood town line, I checked my rearview mirror. A nondescript gray sedan, a Crown Victoria, was keeping a steady distance behind me. It had been there since I left my house. The Bureau. Thorne was making good on her promise. They were watching. My stomach clenched. I wasn't just a guy leaving town. I was a fugitive with a valuable, dangerous asset in my passenger seat. I couldn't lead them. I drove for an hour on the main highway, acting casual, before taking a sudden exit onto a winding state route. I'd spent enough time exploring the back roads to know the lay of the land. I made a series of sharp, unpredictable turns onto logging trails and unpaved county roads, kicking up a plume of dust. I pushed the old Ford truck harder than I ever had, the engine complaining as we bounced over ruts and gravel. After 20 minutes of weaving through the dense Maine wilderness, I pulled back onto a different highway. I checked my mirror again and again. The sedan was gone. For now. That night, we checked into a cheap motel 300 miles away on the border of New Hampshire. I paid in cash. In the dim, flickering light of the bathroom, I looked at my reflection. Alex Turner, ER nurse from Chicago, was a ghost. He was a name in a bureau file, a liability. He had to disappear. I took a cheap, disposable plastic razor and shaved off the beard I'd had for years. I threw my old jacket in a dumpster out back and bought a new one along with a baseball cap from a 24-hour Walmart. The next morning, we were back on the road before sunrise. Lobo was asleep in the passenger seat, his head resting on the worn upholstery, letting out a soft, contented sigh. I looked at my strange, monstrous, noble friend. I didn't know his origins. I didn't know if there were more like him. I didn't know what ancient war we had just stumbled into. All I knew was that our journey wasn't over. It had just begun. We weren't running from something anymore. We were just running. The weeks bled into a new kind of normal. A life lived on the move, a blur of asphalt, cheap coffee, and anonymous motel rooms that all smelled faintly of bleach and despair. I became a ghost. I took odd jobs for cash, hauling lumber on a construction site in Pennsylvania, washing dishes in a greasy spoon diner in Ohio. I never stayed in one place for more than a few days. I paid for everything with cash, kept my head down, and avoided security cameras like they were the plague. It was a lonely, paranoid existence, but we were free, and we were together. My nights were spent hunched over my laptop in dimly lit rooms, with Lobo sleeping soundly at my feet. His presence was a constant, solid reassurance. I had Mrs. Gable's map spread out on the peeling veneer of a motel desk, and I used it as my key. I began a grim, obsessive project, cross-referencing the locations of other deep, isolated lakes on her map with online archives of local newspapers from across the country. I was looking for patterns, for whispers in the static. A small town in the Ozarks where 3 campers vanished in the 80s. A string of boating accidents on a remote lake in the Rockies in the 50s. Slowly, a terrifying tapestry began to emerge. It was the same story, repeated over and over, separated by decades and hundreds of miles. A quiet town, a deep lake, a sudden spike in disappearances, always officially ruled accidental, and sometimes buried deep in the folklore sections of local historical societies. I'd find a corresponding myth, a bogman, a water troll, and almost always a parallel legend of a guardian spirit, a great wolf or dog that haunted the woods. It was a national secret history of bloodshed and defense. We were in Oregon, driving through the misty, evergreen-choked mountains when I saw the sign. We'd stopped for gas in a one-street town called Cascade Falls. In the window of the local newspaper office, a headline on the front page caught my eye. Local fisherman reports unprecedented aggression from wildlife near Mirror Lake. I bought a copy. The article was short. It detailed strange behavior from deer and bears, avoiding the lake's shore. It quoted an old man who claimed something huge and dark had slammed into the bottom of his boat, nearly capsizing him. He described it as feeling like a damn whale. The article ended with the sheriff dismissing it as a likely sturgeon or an overactive imagination. A cold dread, grimly familiar, washed over me. I looked at Lobo in the truck. He was sitting up, his body rigid, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring east, in the direction of the mountains, in the direction of Mirror Lake. I drove. I didn't know why, not consciously, but some instinct deeper than reason took the wheel. The town of Cascade Falls was a postcard-perfect copy of Havenwood, a sleepy little hamlet nestled in a valley, cradled by a deep, dark body of water. As we got closer, Lobo's agitation grew. He began to pace in the passenger seat, a low whine escaping his throat. He stared at the lake with the same fixed, intense focus I had seen him use on Loon Lake. And in that moment, the truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. We hadn't been running aimlessly. We hadn't been just fleeing. His instincts, his ancient programming, had been guiding us all along. He was a seeker, a sentinel. He was drawn to these places, these festering wounds on the map where the barrier between worlds was thin. We hadn't been running from Havenwood. We had been running to Cascade Falls. We weren't fugitives. We were first responders. I pulled the truck over at a scenic overlook, the engine ticking as it cooled. I looked at Lobo, then at the unsuspecting town below, sleeping peacefully on the edge of its own private abyss. My role in this, my purpose, crystallized with terrifying clarity. I was no longer just a man trying to protect his dog. I was a partner, a handler. He was the weapon, but I was the one who could read the maps, talk to the locals, gather the intelligence. I was his eyes and ears in the human world. I was the man for the werewolf. My fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But now, it was overlaid with a grim, hardened resolve. My life as Alex Turner was over. My hope for a quiet life was a forgotten dream. This was my life now. This road, this truck, this dog, this war. I looked at Lobo, who met my gaze, his amber eyes steady and knowing. "Well, buddy," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "Looks like we've got work to do." I reached into the glove compartment, pushing aside the old registration papers and maps. My fingers closed around the cold, heavy steel of the 12-gauge shotgun. I checked the action. It was loaded. The hunt was on.